Nou, ik geef even een introductie toch? Ja? Hello? Can everybody hear me? Okay. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Carwin Chung. I am the chair for the third panel today, the last panel already again. I will keep things short for my introduction because we're running a bit short on time. And as my title of chair suggests, I'm just part of the stage furniture today. So today we have Guozhen Zhou, MA student at Leiden, who will talk about late Tang Buddhism. Go-eun Yu, who will talk with MA student at the Korea University for Cultural Heritage on Korean lacquerware in East Asian context. Steven Hoekstra, MA student of Japanese Studies and Art History at Leiden University on the process of print design in early modern Japan. And Kuldeep Kaur Singh on the transnational creation of values in Chinese jade jewelry in the early 20th century. Can I invite Guozhen on the stage? Thank you.
Thank you, Carwin, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Guozhen Zhou. I'm from Leiden University, and this is my topic today. So without further ado, let's get started. My topic will bring us back to the medieval China. In the year 846 CE, during the late Tang Dynasty, a local official from Sichuan province commissioned the construction of 3 Buddhist niches. These niches were dedicated to the Heavenly King, Vaishravana, and the Bodhisattva, Guanyin. At the time, the 2 Buddhist deities were the most popular icons, and the niches construction was also in a very good order according to the inscription. Nothing hindered the project. However, what is unusual here is that the construction should not be so smooth, because surprisingly, this project was carried out in the exact 6th year of the Huichang era, one of the most devastating periods of Buddhist persecution that ever happened in Chinese history. So my report focuses on these special niches and asks a few questions. First, what motivated this local official to openly defy authority and sponsor these niches during such a turbulent time? Then, what is the significance of the main niche featuring Vaishravana? And how should we understand the interplay of political persecution, regional conflicts, and social influences on the faith of Vaishravana during this unique historical period? With these questions in mind, now let us move on to the 3 niches. The 3 niches are located in Bazhong Grottoes in Sichuan, southwest China, adjacent to the renowned Micang Road, the vital transportation road connecting the Tang capital, Shanxi, to the hilly Sichuan region. And thanks to this passage, Bazhong became one of the earliest areas in Sichuan province that was influenced by the tradition of northern Buddhist cave temples. The 3 niches we are discussing today are from Nankan of the Bazhong Grottoes. Their primary donor was Zheng Gong, the governor of Ba County. Here on the slide, we can see the one on the left contains an inscribed stele that recorded Zheng Gong's merit of patronage. The text on it was composed by Xiao Xiang, the ministry administrator of Zheng Gong. This inscription provides very rich information we will revisit later. The central niche is a focal point of today's discussion. It features the Vaishravana as a main deity, flanked by 4 attendants. The goddess Lakshmi, the one in the middle, she was often regarded as Vaishravana's wife or sister. Then his son, Natar, or Naja in Chinese, the one on the right, and 2 heavenly guardians, the smaller 2 on the outside. Then the last niche was commissioned by Zheng Gong's wife, Liu Shi. It contains only 1 deity, Guanyin, and according to the inscription, Liu Shi prayed to Guanyin during an illness. After recovering, she founded this niche as an offering of gratitude. However, today in modern China, Guanyin is a household name. revered as the embodiment of compassion who rescues people in times of danger. Vaishravana, on the other hand, is far less known. Many Chinese might not even recognize him as a Buddhist figure today. But in fact, Vaishravana is one of the four heavenly kings in Buddhism, the guardian of the north, and the protector of the Dharma, the Buddha, and the monastic communities. But during the late Tang, Vaishravana was widely worshipped and was also a household name, just like Guanyin. So why was Vaishravana so prevalent during the Tang Dynasty, and why did it fade away in later history? The answer, I think, lies in two aspects, and they are both explicitly or implicitly illustrated in Zheng Gong's inscription. According to the inscription, Zheng Gong's most direct motive for founding the Vaishravana niche was, I quote, "for the state, official, and the people under his governance," end quote. This motive clearly connects the deity with the symbols of state and power. But how did a Buddhist figure come to embody such political significance? The association can be traced to the practices of a Tang-era esoteric Buddhist master, Amoghavajra. Historical sources like the biographies of eminent monks tell us stories of Amoghavajra's miracles. For example, during the middle of the 8th century, 3 tribes invaded and besieged the city on Tang's northwestern frontier. The emperor then sent Amoghavajra to perform summoning rituals, and eventually Vaishravana's son answered the call, manifested, and defeated the invaders subsequently. For this, the emperor erected a Vaishravana statue on the city wall, which later became a tradition. Amoghavajra was a prolific translator who became very politically influential in Tang China. It was also during this period he translated 5 sutras related to Vaishravana, which popularized the deity's worship among the military. By the first half of the 8th century, Vaishravana's image even appeared on the Tang military's banner. Symbolizing his role has transformed into the protector of cities and the god of war. However, from the mid-Tang onward, the gradual shift of Vaishravana's role was not only thanks to Amoghavajra's translation, but was also closely bounded with the border conflicts. Now, when we turn to Sichuan province, another Tang frontier, we could find similar records about Vaishravana's manifestation. For example, a stele records that Vaishravana once manifested and repelled the invaders who besieged Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan. But of course, we don't know whether Vaishravana truly manifested or not. But we do know that Sichuan was indeed invaded during the late Tang. In 829 CE, just 17 years before Zheng Gong's niches, the Tang government clashed with Nanzhao in a large-scale war in Sichuan. But the war didn't go in favor of the Tang army, although they were blessed by Vaishravana. Eventually, the Sichuanese were driven to the Dadu River, where historical sources describe thousands of them drowning in it. Became a huge tragedy. Here I marked the Dadu River on the map. After reclaiming the lost territory, the Tang government reinforced Sichuan's defenses, and its people can finally, gradually recover from the war. Now, looking back at Zheng Gong's motivations, we can infer that his direct purpose of construction for the state and the people was actually a political declaration, reflecting his duty as a governor who sought divine protection for his territory, and was also a sincere prayer from a civil official during a violent era of regional conflicts. However, the late Tang was more than mere military conflicts. Just as I mentioned in the beginning, Zheng Gong's project also overlapped with the climax of a religious persecution. The stele tells us the niches were completed in the December of the Huichang's 6th year. This timing is very delicate because from the middle of the 5th year to the beginning of the 6th year of Huichang era, Emperor Wuzong issued numerous edicts to suppress Buddhism, leading to the climax of the persecution. The Japanese monk Anning, who traveled to China during Wuzong's reign, documented these events in his book, Record of Travel to Tang in Search of the Dharma. His writings detail Wuzong's policies. For example, in the March of the 5th year, the emperor ordered inspections of Buddhist monastic assets and compelled monks and nuns under 40 to return to secular life. And by April and by July, he even implemented additional bans on Buddhism nationwide. The persecution was also very extensive. Buddhism and Buddhist carvings in Sichuan province were no exception as well. So, under such political uncertainty, when exactly did Zhenggong begin building the niches? Regarding this question, we can only make a rough speculation. As a government official, it would be highly unlikely for Zhenggong to openly build niches during the emperor's explicit ban on Buddhism. One plausible explanation is that in March of the Huichang's 6th year, Emperor Wuzong suddenly passed away. The new emperor ascended shortly after. Around the same time, policies toward Buddhism were shifted rapidly. By May, the new emperor had issued an edict to restore Buddhist monasteries and ordered the execution of the Taoist priest Liu Xuanjing and his followers, accusing them of misleading Wuzong and slandering Buddhism. The accusation clearly was to exempt Wuzong's aggressive anti-Buddhist campaign by blaming the Taoist priest. But it also implicitly suggested that Wuzong's persecution of Buddhism was viewed as a negative or regrettable policy from the new ruler's perspective. It also subtly signaled a change in the new ruler's stance toward Buddhism. Upon hearing the news in May, Zhenggong might have perceived the new emperor's intentions, thus began planning the constructions of the niches, and eventually completing 3 by the end of the year. But of course, the hypothesis rests on a key premise, that is, the political suppression did not shake Zhenggong's personal faith, and his intention of construction already existed prior to the end of the suppression. The inscription reveals Zhenggong's deep devotion in Buddhism. He hopes that Vaishnavana would protect both his state and his faith. Vaishnavana here simultaneously fulfills the role of a guardian deity protecting the state and its people, while also manifesting as a Dharma protector, safeguarding Buddhist teachings and monastic communities. But still, the 3 niches prompt us to ask further, what did Vaishnavana mean to a lay Buddhist like Zhenggong during this period? And what about to the broader common people? Or, in other words, how was Vaishnavana perceived, accepted, and transformed in the late Tang Dynasty? Well, today when we discuss Vaishnavana in the late Tang Dynasty, we naturally associate him with the Amoghavajra, and by extension, the esoteric Buddhism he represented. However, when we examine Vaishnavana from the perspective of patronage or ordinary people in Tang Dynasty, we could find that this deity possessed a far more complex divine nature and a broader range of functions. Zhenggong's stele tells us how Xiaoxiang, the ghostwriter of this inscription, understood and accepted Vaishnavana. He wrote, I quote here, I once criticized Buddhist scriptures, but when I read the Vaishnavana Sutra, I came to realize that the Heavenly King suppresses rebellions and eliminates evils for the people and the emperor. Thus, Vaishnavana was meritorious. The meritorious here clearly referred to merit in service or to the state. In Xiaoxiang's view, politics takes precedence. Buddhism functions in a subordinate role to uphold the state. This is actually an idea deeply rooted in Confucian logic, and Zheng Gong likely shared this point of view as well. So I think Zheng Gong's belief system can be described as Buddhism in form and Confucianism in essence. And within this framework, the Vaishnavana here has transformed into a political deity in the Confucian moral system and social hierarchy. Yet, this is still not the full picture of Vaishnavana's belief in the late Tang. In Zheng Gong's stele, we can still find even more details. For example, descriptions of the rituals he performed to worship Vaishnavana. When we compare them with Amogha Vajra's ritual manual of Vaishnavana, Pishamen Yigui, we find a high degree of similarity. However, we cannot simply conclude from the comparison that Zheng Gong's practice was purely esoteric. In contrast, many Tang Dynasty texts record stories of Vaishnavana's miraculous manifestations as well. For example, in Youyang Zazu, there are 2 stories of people tattooing Vaishnavana on their back, and thus was protected or gained supernatural power. And interestingly, these accounts also describe how these people worshipped Vaishnavana. They are all closely resembling Zheng Gong's ritual practices. Yet, obviously, tattooing a deity on one's back is a very secularized form of devotion. Additionally, we can also find some clues from other Vaishnavana carvings. Also in Bajong grottos, there are several niches for Vaishnavana, and one of them was commissioned by a county magistrate in 877 CE. The magistrate left us a message in the inscription indicating his reason for patronage. I built the Vaishnavana for my own illness and suffering. Particularly in Sichuan, these records offer us a broader social perspective for analyzing Vaishnavana. What we can understand is that by the late Tang Dynasty, Vaishnavana had seemingly evolved into a popular deity, just like Guan Yin. He was symbolized as a god of war, a protector, and even a healer and alleviator of sufferings. And particularly in Sichuan, we find numerous niches dedicated to Vaishnavana, suggesting that this deity received special reverence in the region. Now, when we revisit Zheng Gong's 3 niches, the unusual pairing of Vaishnavana and Guan Yin begins to make sense. They were both beloved folk deities of the time. Although much like Guan Yin, Vaishnavana's worship in the late Tang was deeply rooted in secular life. The differences lies in their later trajectories. Guan Yin became one of the most central figures in Chinese religion, while Vaishnavana's role was gradually divided between 2 historical figures, Li Jing and Guan Yu. Today, this once widespread guardian deity has all but vanished from Chinese collective memory. But thanks to Zheng Gong, we can glimpse just how Vaishnavana was perceived, accepted, and transformed during the late Tang period. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's really honored to be here. And I've noticed that I'm the one who talks about Korean art in this symposium, so I feel like I'm representing Korea right now. Anyway, the topic of my presentation is the position of Korean lacquerware in East Asian art. Before I begin, I'd like to briefly outline what I'll be talking about today. So my goal is to introduce one of Korea's traditional crafts, 나전칠기, or mother-of-pearl inlay lacquerware, and to share how this technique evolved and was exchanged across East Asia. The reason I chose this topic is simple. As a Korean, lacquerware inlaid with mother-of-pearl is one of the most familiar and meaningful forms of crafts to me. I also believe it is one of the most refined and skillful traditional techniques that Korean has developed. At the same time, it has a long and rich history that spans China, Korea, and Japan, where it developed through centuries of cultural exchanges. So in today's presentation, I'll explore how lacquer techniques were exchanged and transformed across these three countries. So lacquerware with mother-of-pearl is more than just beautiful craft. It is an art form that reflects the aesthetics and cultural values of East Asia. So here's how the talk will go. First, I will discuss the origins of mother-of-pearl inlay technique. Next, I will introduce specific example of lacquerware from each region to show how styles and techniques were shared and adapted. So in general, the decorative technique of East Asian lacquerware are described like this. So China is known for carved lacquer, and Japan for makie, and Korea for mother-of-pearl inlay. So you might wonder why compare the lacquer traditions of our three regions based solely on mother-of-pearl inlay work. So interestingly, the inlay technique itself originated in China, where it flourished during the Tang Dynasty in 8th century. So around the same time, the technique was introduced to Korea's unified Silla period and Japan's Nara period. So through Tang China's international trade, inlay work spread across East Asia. A representative example is the mother-of-pearl bronze mirror found in Korea, China, and Japan. The earliest non-Korean example is the bronze mirror inlaid with mother-of-pearl and floral animal design, now housed in the Lee Museum of Art. This is the central piece on this slide, with the Chinese mirror on the left and the Japanese one on the right. So at the first glance, they might look similar, but there are important differences. So for example, the Chinese mirror features human figures as the main design on the left, and while the Korean and Japanese ones are densely decorated with the floral motifs. So this suggests not only the spread of technique, but also regional adaptations of aesthetic taste. So in Korea, it was during Goryeo Dynasty that the inlay technique truly reached a level of refinement. A Chinese envoy named Su Jing visited Goryeo in 1123 and wrote in his book named Illustrated Account of Shunhei Embassy to Goryeo that the inlay work of Goryeo is so intricate that it may be considered truly precious. This shows that Korean lacquerware had already achieved the highest technical level in East Asia by the 12th century. Then a question arises. Why did technique flourish so significantly in Korea, more so than in China or Japan? Was it because Koreans were never unfamiliar with the other lacquer techniques like carved lacquer or makie? Well, I don't think so. If you look at the records from the Song and Goryeo dynasty, we find that both carved lacquerware were gifted to Korea as a royal tribute, and makie technique as well as during the Goryeo and Joseon period. So there are two main reasons why Korea still chose to focus on mother-of-pearl inlay. First, the matter of aesthetic preference. Even within East Asia, countries has had different artistic tastes, of course. China preferred bold and dramatic designs carved into the lacquer surface. Japan was captivated by the refined precision of painting with gold powder, but Korean favored the subtle and iridescent iridescent beauty of mother of pearl, which aligned with more restrained and quiet sense of beauty. So in that way, mother of pearl suited the Korean aesthetic perfectly. Second, it's about the material availability. Carved lacquer requires large amounts of lacquer sap, and makie demands gold powder intensively. But Korean inlay work relies on mother of pearl, which were relatively easy to obtain in Korea. Because Korea is surrounded on 3 sides by the sea, as well as Jeju Island, provided a stable source of high-quality abalone. So in short, Korea had both the aesthetic inclination and the material resources to fully develop this technique. It allowed for creation of high-end decorative art using material that was not only accessible, but also visually stunning. So in this way, the mother of pearl inlay technique that originated in Tang, China, spread across East Asia and was adapted differently in each region. And among this, Korea elevated the technique to a level of artistic sophistication that continues to be admired today. Next, let's take a closer look at how lacquerware with mother of pearl inlay developed in each country. So we'll start with the Goryeo dynasty in Korea and Yuan dynasty in China and Heian period in Japan. Goryeo lacquerware is known for its extremely fine and delicate mother of pearl inlays, often arranged in vine patterns, into vine chrysanthemum or peonies, or sometimes lotus. Chrysanthemums, one of the oldest ornamental plants in East Asia, were believed to have medicinal powers for longevity. They also symbolize the virtue of noble gentlemen in Confucian ideology. To the left, we can see Yuan dynasty lacquer piece from China, mostly in the form of boxes or trays. It features landscape paintings and architecture scenes with figures, and in the decorative border, you can still see chrysanthemums and peony vines, similar to Korean designs. So this shows that the shared visual culture across East Asia. In Japan, mother of pearl inlay was often used together with makie techniques. One notable motif is the carriage wheels, you can see on the slide, which was popular during the Heian period and reflects Japanese aesthetic of the time. So let's now move on to the next period, the Joseon dynasty in Korea and Ming and Qing dynasty in China and the Edo period in Japan. In Joseon, the shift toward Neo-Confucianism and the suppression of Buddhism and also identity of a new country bring some changes in designs. So you can see these flower motifs became more larger and more fairly arranged on the surface. In Ming and Qing dynasty, this piece shown on the left, dated to the 16th and 17th century, features motifs such as pavilions, mountains, people, and birds. So compared to Korean lacquerware, Chinese pieces of this period are often more pictorial and narrative in style. Meanwhile, in Japan, makie remained central to Japanese lacquer aesthetics. During the Goryeo dynasty, Buddhism was the state religion, and many lacquered cases were created specifically to store Buddhist scriptures. So unfortunately, only about 20 Goryeo mother of pearl lacquer pieces survive today across the world, not only in Korea, but also in Japan and Europe. So on this slide, the second one is housed in Rijksmuseum. These artifacts are more than just a beautiful object, they are testimonies to the technical excellence of Goryeo lacquer work and Korea's cultural prestige in international context of the time. As I mentioned earlier, the most crucial material in making this lacquerware is the mother of pearl, or dajeon in Korean. So in Korea, abalone shells were traditionally harvested from the 3 sites of coast. Among them, the northern disc abalone was most commonly used. This type of shell has a shimmering and iridescent quality, combining bluish and reddish tones, but it has some disadvantage. So it tends to be smaller in size and uneven on surface texture. So because of this, Korean lacquerware often features very small and delicate motifs and requires higher refined techniques to cut and apply the thin layers of the shell. So here I will show an enlarged image of floral motifs on Korea lacquerware. So in contrast, China and Japan primarily used turban shells, which are larger, thicker, and have a smooth, purely white tone. This material allowed for bigger and more pictorial designs, particularly in Chinese lacquerware. So for instance, since featuring landscape figures and architectures became common. So to render finer details on these thicker shells, Chinese artisans developed a technique known as carving or engraving into the surface of the shell. So here you can see a Chinese piece with engraved design motif made using thick shells inlay. So despite the differences in materials, there were also many shared techniques across East Asia. Two of the most widespread are 주름질 and 끊음질 in Korean. So let me explain each in turn. 주름질, which is the cutting technique, is the process of cutting shell pieces according to the shape of design pattern. So today, Korean artisans use fine saws, but during the Joseon dynasty, when such tool didn't exist, shells were softened by soaking them into hot tea or like vinegar, then cut by hand using scissors, needles, or awls. So here I show examples of 주름질 work from Korea, China, and Japan. Next, 끊음질, which is thread cutting technique, involves slicing mother of pearl into fine thread-like strands, then cutting them into short segments to form carved lines or stumps. So this was especially useful in depicting vines, flower stumps, or contour lines in the landscape scenes. So this technique was widely used from late Goryeo into Joseon period, particularly in scroll-like vine decoration, and later in more painful motifs. So here we can compare examples of this method across 3 countries. So you can also find this technique in Japanese Namban lacquerware, on the third one in this slide. So exported to Europe after the 16th century, you might know that. So even though the techniques were shared, the results were shaped by each country's materials and aesthetic preferences. So now let me share a fun story with you. Have any of you seen the recent K-drama, When Life Gives You Tangerines? Yes? Okay, that's great. So there's a scene where the mother shows her daughter a mother of pearl wardrobe and says, "This is 통영 mother of pearl wardrobe. I will pass on to you one day." Here you can see the wardrobe behind the figure. Also, this is not the fiction. 통영, which is the coastal city in South Province in Korea, has been a center of lacquerware production since late 16th century. So after Japanese invasion in 1592, a naval craft workshop called 통제영 was established there to supply military goods. But because of its access to high-quality balloon and lacquer, it became a perfect site for developing lacquer craft. So thanks to this history, 통영 gained the nickname of the hometown of mother of pearl wardrobe. And during the 1970s and 80s, lacquered wardrobe became a popular part of wedding dowries, and that's why mom was really excited to pass down to her daughter. So even more interesting, all 4 officially designated holders of Korea's intangible heritage title for lacquer inlay today studied under the masters from 통영. So this shows how even now these techniques from over 1,300 years ago are being passed down through a clearly defined lineage. So in the end, mother of pearl lacquerware is not just about decoration. It's a complex cultural product shaped by material availability and aesthetic values, international exchange, and the hands-off generation of skilled artisans. So by comparing the commonalities and differences in the lacquer tradition of East Asia, we can appreciate how this traditional art form continues to convey its historical beauty to us today. So thank you so much.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying the symposium so far. And for those who've been here from the start, I hope you still have some energy left for the last two presentations of today. In my presentation, I will talk about early modern Japanese woodblock prints by the 19th century artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi. In particular, I will talk about the production process, or more specifically, how woodblock prints are designed. I will take you on a journey that begins with the concept of a print in Kuniyoshi's mind, and that will gradually go from a rough preliminary sketch to a beautifully detailed drawing ready to be carved and made into a print. And the corpus of objects I'm using is around 1,200 sketches that are housed at the Wereldmuseum in Leiden. And as Thomas van Gulik already said in the introduction, modern technology has really significantly eased my research. But before we jump into the technical details, however, I would first like to give some important contextual information for those of you who are less familiar with Japanese woodblock prints. So I will start by showing you a map of Japan from 1811, the end of the Edo period. Early modern Japan is better known as the Edo period, named after its capital, Edo, which is nowadays Tokyo. This period dates from 1603 until 1868 and succeeds the grueling Warring States period, where the fragmented provinces of Japan waged war for political dominance. However, when Tokugawa Ieyasu unified this fragmented country in 1603, an unprecedented time of relative peace and prosperity commenced, lasting for more than 250 years. This period is sometimes called the Pax Tokugawa, after the Tokugawa family who ruled Japan during this time. So urban centers such as Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka thrived as cultural and economic nexuses during this time. This, in combination with the peaceful times, caused the arts to flourish. In particular, woodblock printing became a very popular form of art catered towards the masses. Literacy among commoners also became widespread. They could go to so-called terakoya, or temple schools, where they could learn how to read and write. And finally, a new social class emerged in these urban societies, the chonin, or townspeople, who came to occupy the majority of cities and create their own distinct culture. So our journey brings us to Edo around the mid-19th century, when it was the largest metropolis in the world, with over 1 million inhabitants. The shogun, or military dictator, lived in the center of the city, surrounded by artisans, merchants, and his many vassals, who he forced to reside in the capital. Edo became the most important place in Japan during the Edo period for economic, political, and cultural reasons. So in this area of Edo, known as the Shitamachi, or downtown, was where the so-called chonin bunka, or townspeople culture, emerged. This culture was characterized by the hedonistic lifestyle of its inhabitants, spending most of their free time in the pleasure districts of Edo, visiting the many kabuki theaters, brothels, and bathhouses. This lifestyle, based on the transience of life, was called the floating world, and quickly became the main subject of woodblock prints, subsequently called ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world. At many street corners in this densely occupied district were shops where piles of prints and illustrated books depicting the floating world were ready to be bought by the Edo populace. The production process of woodblock prints was a collaborative endeavor involving the publisher, artist, block cutter, and printer, also known sometimes as the ukiyo-e quartet. The publisher was the principal driving force. They approached the artist for a design, or sometimes they were commissioned one privately, ensured it was properly carved by skilled block cutters, and paid the printers for the initial run, all while staying attuned to the latest fads and fashions of Edo. In addition to financing the labor, the publisher was also responsible for supplying the wooden blocks, paper, and colorants. As a result, the publisher had to invest a large sum of money before even a single sheet was sold. Somewhere else in the shitamachi, the artist would create a neat block-ready drawing on extremely thin paper known as the hanshita-e, which was then glued onto the wood block, ready to be carved. The creation of a hanshita-e follows a string of rough preliminary sketches, followed by repeated tracing and refining until a satisfactory final design was realized. Reputable artists from influential schools, such as the Utagawa or Katsushika lineages, often oversaw numerous pupils who assisted in producing designs and meeting the never-ending demand for prints. Upon receiving the hanshita-e, the block cutter would paste the drawing face down onto a smooth, fine-grained plank of mountain cherry wood, transferring a mirrored image to the block. They would then proceed to carefully carve away the areas not to be printed with a vast array of chisels and gouges, leaving only the triangular-shaped ridges to define the contour of the design. The artist would subsequently give instructions on where what colors would go, and a series of color blocks would be carved. The publisher would transport the color blocks to a printing studio, where the final stage of production commenced. The printer sits cross-legged in front of a boot block on a slight angle, surrounded by various tools and balls with pigments. He would place a thick sheet of mulberry paper, which was slightly damp, flat on top of the block, and use a bamboo pad to rub across the back of the paper in quick circular and horizontal strokes. This process was repeated for each color block until a fully colored print was produced. All right, now that I have explained the historical context and the basic principles of woodblock print production, I will continue by discussing Utagawa Kuniyoshi's design process. As there is unfortunately not enough time to delve deep into each individual step of the design process, I will instead describe some of the fundamental characteristics and techniques employed by Kuniyoshi, or for that matter, any other woodblock print artist. Quickly, before we start, I would like to give a rough idea of where the design process starts and ends. So by showing you a very early stage sketch and its corresponding published print. Although the sketch and the print show many compositional similarities, there is a significant disparity between the level of detail and refinement. Due to the nature of Japanese sketching, which is done with ink and brush, erasing mistakes was near impossible. Once a design was too cluttered with brushstrokes, it had to be transferred onto a new sheet of paper until a detailed enough drawing was realized. One can imagine the number of steps it would take to go from the left image to the right. So the first step, or often but not always the first step in designing a print, was transferring the artist's idea onto a miniature sketch. This sketch was primarily used to experiment with the composition, particularly the position of figures. To give a sense of scale, I have put such a miniature sketch next to a standard full-size drawing on this slide. So the miniature sketch in this case is roughly the size of a post-it note, while the full-scale drawing is more like an elongated A4. So some characteristics of miniature sketches are the overall lack of detail and positional experimentation, as the small size of these sketches won't allow for either. So for example, the waves are simple triangular lines, the head is a mere oval shape, the feet don't have toes, the hands don't have fingers, and the tree in the background is just a thick brushstroke with its branches being singular lines, alluding to a canopy of overhanging branches. So the second step in the design process is transferring the miniature sketch onto a full-scale piece of paper. These sketches are characterized by, as Marco Fagioli aptly states, a frenzy of unbridled brushstrokes. This step is actually characteristic of Kuniyoshi, not other woodblock artists. So the other steps can basically be similar for other woodblock artists, but this one is specific to Kuniyoshi. So this drawing of Rori Hakucho Chojun, one of the outlaw heroes from the famous classic Chinese novel 108 Heroes of the Popular Water Margin, perfectly demonstrates the chaotic nature of Kuniyoshi's early stage drawings. So as I have already briefly mentioned, despite its entanglement of thick, loose brushstrokes, the composition is already mostly solidified. The figure's pose is nearly identical. The gate contains the same number of bars. The downward direction of the water is indicated, and even some arrows are already in place. Noteworthy, however, is the disparity in the application of ink in detail between the figure and his surrounding environment. The overall appearance of Chojun is more assured than the background. The lines are thinner and the considerable care is taken in the suggestion of muscle. Conversely, the gate and water are drawn with bold lines merely as indication of their existence. These types of early sketches are also characterized by positional experimentation. Instead of applying a small, clean piece of paper on top of the desired place of alteration, Kuniyoshi drew over his initial design with progressively thicker lines until he was satisfied. So in this particular drawing, Kuniyoshi drew 3 iterations of the right arm, and to spare everyone a headache from trying to figure out where these are, I have indicated them here. And from the published print, we know that the blue iteration is the final one, and I believe that it is because Kuniyoshi was not content with the position of red and yellow, as this would narrow the figure too much. By extending the right arm outward, the figure's shoulders become broader and would create a more imposing look, something which is fitting for a hero from the water margin. When Kuniyoshi was satisfied with the composition, he would begin adding details or make slight alterations by pasting small pieces of paper on the sketch, particularly on the faces and limbs of the figures. These pieces of paper are called pentimenti. In this sketch of a historical wrestling match, pentimenti are primarily used to slightly adjust the placement of limbs and faces, suggesting that Kuniyoshi is content with the overall composition of the design. For example, if you take a look at the face of the right wrestler, it has been moved downward relative to its initial position, which is visible beneath the pentimento as sort of faint bluish lines. Now, as it is quite difficult to notice pentimenti on photographs, I have indicated the area here, which is the pentimenti. But apparently, Kuniyoshi was not satisfied with this correction and decided to add another smaller pentimenti on top of the already existing one. And from a distance, it's quite hard to spot the second pentimenti. At least it took me a while before I noticed this was here. But the small, loose right-hand corner is a strong giveaway, if you look at the photo. In real life, it's much more easier to see. As the design process develops into later stages, pentimenti are also used to refine details beyond anatomy, such as sword decorations and garment folds, which I will discuss shortly. But first, another fundamental technique used by virtually every woodblock artist is tracing. In a way, drawing on top of pentimenti is also tracing, but be it on a much smaller scale. When an early stage sketch, as we have seen up until now, becomes too chaotic, it was traced onto a new sheet of paper to create a clean version upon which could be continued sketching. It is unlikely that a master like Kuniyoshi would produce these tracings himself. Instead, it is reasonable to assume that one of his many pupils would do this. After all, it was common practice for a pupil to copy and trace their master's work to learn from it. And to illustrate this, this assumption is supported by the disjointed, awkwardly drawn lines found in many professional tracings. The broken, non-continuous lines, often started anew, indicate the painstaking quest for the right line in a haystack of preliminary brushstrokes. A pupil, unlike Kuniyoshi, had to constantly pause and deliberate over which line to follow of the original sketch. This type of jagged line work is clearly visible in the previous tracing of two fighting warriors, but it can also be seen in the left image of hysterically laughing women. The brushstrokes are frequently interrupted with slight pauses of the brush that result in an accumulation of blotted ink, or the brush is lifted off the paper, causing gaps between the lines. An unexperienced pupil was at work here. On the contrary, a tracing of a group of monks holding bowls and frivolously chattering away portrays a more consistent handling of the brush. This tracing shows an unprecedented uniformity. Brushstrokes flow in continuous motion across the paper, exhibiting scarcely any sign of hesitation. Though not quite a definitive sketch, the disparity between this and the previous examples demonstrate an apparent deficient in the labor in the artist studio. The master supplies a full-scale sketch with pentimenti, which were then traced and developed by pupils of varying skills. To quickly highlight the varying quality of tracings, I have put two tracings of the same design next to each other, and it is immediately apparent that the right version is a later, more detailed tracing done by a more experienced and confident hand. When a tracing was refined enough, the artist or his pupil would start to add finer details such as patterns and other decorative adornments. Notice too how some areas are colored in with black ink and how the faces show a faint red blush at this stage. If necessary, small alterations could still be made by using pentimenti. An example of a small alteration can be found on the left figure's garment, where the folds have been moved slightly downward to create a more comprehensible image. A slightly more drastic positional alteration is seen in the sword hilt of the right figure. It has been moved up considerably using a pentimento, while the two decorative plumes attached to the scabbard remain on the same horizontal axis. In the first draft, the hilt was likely too close or perhaps even touching the plumes, resulting in a less elegant design. Additionally, the decorations have only been added on the pentimento, suggesting satisfaction with the new placement. Additionally, both figures show the inclusion of patterns and other decorations from their rough appearance. However, we can conclude that they have been added in the stage of the design process. Lines do not always connect, they frequently overlap and display a certain degree of inconsistency. Such rough draft version of patterns could be worked up later by pasting on pentimenti. In this drawing, the elaborately decorated kimono is covered with pentimenti in the areas where the artist was not satisfied with the line work of the patterns. All the faint blue areas on the kimono are areas where pentimenti is pasted on. Once the artist was satisfied with the drawing, it would be traced one last time to create the block-ready drawing, or the hanshitae, which would then be sent to the block cutter studio. Whether the artist or a very skilled pupil traced the block-ready drawing cannot be said with 100% certainty, but most likely it was a combination of both. As the final tracing would be destroyed during the carving process, the line impression is the closest positively identifiable conception of a block-ready drawing. Note, however, that colors that did not have a black outline would be added in a later stage. Several line impressions would be sent back to the artist, who would then annotate them with instructions for the color block. With my presentation today, I wanted to show a side of woodblock printing that is often overlooked, the many intricacies involved in designing a print. A rough outline of the process is as follows. The artist starts with a miniature sketch, transfers this to a full-scale size, refines it by using pentimenti, traces it to create a clean copy, and continues refining and adding detail until a final definitive tracing can be made, called the hanshitae, or block-ready drawing. Additionally, I would like to reiterate that the designing of a print is only a third of the complete process. The immaculate precision of the block cutters and the undervalued techniques of their printers must also not be forgotten. I hope that after today, the next time you see a Japanese woodblock print, you will view it in a different light, one that acknowledges the large collaborative industry behind it and one that appreciates the many steps involved in creating a finished design. Thank you very much.
Invite the speakers back on stage. I'm happy to report we're back on schedule, so I think I'll do a round of questions for the speakers, and maybe then I'll open the floor to the audience. So, Guozhen, I want to challenge you a bit on your use of the religious-secular divide in your talk and your idea of Buddhism in form but Confucian in content. Because I wonder if this is not actually rooted in what is essentially a modern post-Enlightenment conception of religion being separate from politics. Whereas if we look at the historical and, for that matter, mythical record, we see that Buddhism, from its earliest days, was actually deeply, deeply entrenched in politics, diplomacy, warfare. We can see this from King Ashoka in India to Prince Shotoku in Japan. And I think your reference to this Buddhist miracle leading to a military victory is quite interesting in that regard, because there's a whole host of examples where this happens, right? This a Buddhist miracle leading to a military victory, and whereas there are very few Confucian miracles leading to a military victory. I think the Confucian scholars are mostly concerned with losing beautifully, like we lost the battle, but at least we still have our morals. So why can't this be Buddhist in form, but also Buddhist in content?
So, yeah, you're right. Thanks for the question. I think you're very right that Buddhism was initially already like engaged in politics a lot back to this, the period in India. But there is a difference between Indian Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism. That the logic, the Chinese Buddhism, when Buddhism came to China, that Chinese there were already like a so-called religious system, that is the Confucianism, or the Wei don't think is a religion. The system is already rooted in Chinese people's mind, and also I think in China that Buddhism were not so like of the emperor, the politics was in the dominant position. So Buddhism and other religions like Taoism, they were like suppressed by the Confucianism, although sometimes they interact with each other. Sometimes there is a kind of a power dynamics that one religion takes being more dominant and one is less. So that is the context for this question, I think. And regarding the military and the civil officials, I think also Zheng Gong, this person is very specific and quite unusual because, as I mentioned, he is a civil official in this region, but also on the other, meanwhile, in the inscriptions, there are some clues that we can find. Maybe he's also serving in the military because he has a military administrator working for him. So, in his regard, well, I think Buddhism works on him like both for his civil official nature, also his military official nature. So it's different. It's a little bit like nuanced themes on him. Yeah, that's mostly if I present myself clearly. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Stefan, I have a question for you. I think your presentation was lovely in taking us along what we're seeing on these design sketches, but you didn't really cover what we're not seeing in these design sketches. And of course, the big selling point for Nishiki is, as the name suggests, color.
Yes.
And there's almost a complete absence of color in these design sketches. Whereas, well, by contrast, if you, for example, look at post-Renaissance oil sketches in the Western tradition, there's this very sort of obsession with contrasting colors, complementing colors, whereas here it's just painting in ink. So maybe could you reflect a bit on this absence of color?
Yeah, of course. So in Japan, So the notion of drawing in Japan is already not really a thing how I am using it today in my presentation, especially if you compare it to the West. In the West, we really have sort of the concept of drawing with watercolors and colored pencils and stuff. So if you make a sketch, it's usually with colors. In Japan, however, drawing, as I was using it today, is more linked to painting, inked painting. So these drawings that I've shown today are essentially sort of very rough ink paintings, and the coloring of them would happen after would happen after the block-ready drawing was made, because first they needed a block-ready drawing so they could get sort of a line impression. So if you press the block-ready drawing on a wood block and you carve this image out, you get sort of an image with all the black lines of your design. And once you have the black outlines, you know where the color is going to be. Because if you add the color on the block-ready drawing, that would serve no purpose, since those areas would be carved away anyway. So color would always be added after the block-ready drawing was finished. So when they have these line impressions, they would usually be sent back to the artist, and then on those pieces of paper, they would either sort of write down what color was going to be, or sometimes they would color in specific areas. Each color gets a single sheet, and those sheets would get sent back to the block cutters, and then when the block cutters put those pieces of paper on the block, they could carve away everything around the colors. And in that way, you add the colors to these drawings. So yeah, color was not used as we use it in the West with drawing.
Very good, thank you. Actually, we're running a bit close on time, so maybe I will open the stage to the audience. Maybe are there any questions from the audience?
Want to.
Just to continue the discussion on the technical part, Steven explained about printing the wood blocks. If I understand well, you have a concept of a drawing, and then you paste it on a wood block, and then you start cutting it out. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, so you have these the pictures I showed in the end, the very detailed pictures, and you paste them with sort of a glue. So the paper is like paper thin, very wafer thin. So once you paste it on the wood block, it would almost be transparent, and the block cutter would see
So that's,
sort of the black
I understand that, but that means that when you have your print, you'll have a mirror image of the drawing.
But then once the mirror, exactly, so the wood block is a mirrored image, but then once you paste another clean sheet of paper and you print it with color, then you have a sort of the non-mirrored image again.
Yeah, but that means how do you handle that when you have scripts, because you can't have a mirror image of a character.
So the people who wrote the characters on these to be cut, they actually wrote them mirrored.
Mirrored, yeah.
They were very skilled calligraphers who could write sort of the Chinese characters mirrored. So then once they would be pasted, they would not be mirrored.
Thank you, it's quite fascinating.
Do we have any questions for Koen or Koldip?
Sorry, Stephen, I'm just going to bother you once again. My only question was, what made you choose as your case study Utagawa Kuniyoshi, and for example, not Hiroshige III or Hokusai? What made you choose this artist in particular?
So Utagawa, Hiroshige III, and Hokusai both have quite a few sketches as well, but Utagawa Kuniyoshi, together with Kawanabe Kyosai, an artist from the late 19th century, they have sort of the largest corpus of sketches known to us today. And one of those, that collection is at the Wereldmuseum Leiden. And I worked there as an intern last year on these sketches, so that's kind of how this all transitioned into my thesis.
I saw that Oliver had a question.
Those 4 brilliant talks, I enjoyed them all. I had a question for Gowun and Kuldip, I wonder if you both see, I know that history doesn't really repeat itself, but the remarkable correspondences between jade jewelry and some of what Gowun talked about, those mirrors, the mirrors probably made for women. We don't know the archaeology always of those Kofun tombs and equivalents in China and Japan. These are valuable materials. They both emanate from big industries, huge rocks, foundries for bronze and making mirrors and so on. They're both small, they're both transportable, and they're both, they share mother of pearl, they share small bits of mineral. They share interesting distribution systems as well, modern printing and publishing between Paris and New York and so on. And then the diplomacy and trade between the mainland, Korea, Japan, ceremonial correspondences as well, going to the opera, going to the theatre, burial, which is the biggest theatricality of East Asia in early medieval, early modern times. I wonder what you both think of that. Have you noticed this yourselves?
Yes, definitely. When I look at a presentation of mother of pearls, and also earlier this morning, I already sort of thinking about how this kind of sort of natural resources and how they're sourced and sort of circulated and modeled into different types of objects. So of course you have maybe furniture objects, but here or jewelry. But jewelry here is just a case study. Of course, there are also large statues and also figurines that I have not talk about here, but it's also part of my research. And maybe they use sort of a similar, maybe they are having the same sort of professional or social circles of merchants and artisans, but then their value system really vary. I think my larger research is looking at how different social groups sort of mediate and sort of influence the values of jade. So for example, I also look at merchants and artisans and women here in this case, but also later look at other workers. And so, but in terms of the system of the different stones, about the sourcing from natural resources to materials, it definitely overlap, and also the market values and how it is marketed. So I don't know.
So it's like, I just want to add some comments about her mention. And so for resources, that one that you saw on my presentation, the bronze mirror with mother of pearl inlay, there was like a total shell, and then what is that? Well, another like jewelry on the mirror, which is not from East Asia, which is from another country through the international trade at the moment. So you can see all the like international trade through this artifact. So it's really interesting to look at the how these resources come from. Yeah, that's all.
I think it's about time to close the day, but can I have another big round of applause for speakers of panel 2? Thank you all.
So now we go for the final performance.
Well, performance is maybe a big word, but it says closing comments, right? So I will make some closing comments. So it's been a long day. We've heard an enormous amount. We've heard some really interesting, really wide-ranging papers that have been incredibly stimulating. I think we have to ask ourselves, what have we learned? What do we hear when we hear 11 young scholars speak? I think the first thing we've learned is that having a conversation and having collaboration between students and scholars and curators and museum professionals, and maybe also collectors, is really productive. And it's been wonderful to have that conversation today. It's been great to have 3 chairs who are all museum professionals in various ways, Willemijn, Carmen, and Priya, and I think that's something we should not take for granted and continue to treasure. Secondly, I think what you hear when you hear students present things is that they look at things differently. So they pick different things to study, and they go against existing hierarchies or practices or traditions. They bring something completely refreshing. And I think we heard that in Tiffany's paper and in Laura's paper, just to give two examples. And they connect things and places and people and forms of art that other people haven't connected before. And they show how productive that is when you put those things into conversation with each other. And I thought we heard that in Isabella's paper, in Wenjin's paper, in Azar's paper, in Kuldeep's paper just now. And they push back at things. As Priya asked the panel in the middle panel, they expressed that all very well. We heard it perhaps most articulated in Faiz's paper, pushing back at the ways in which power differentials and inequalities continue to shape those connections. And I think all of the papers in different ways, but some in particular, showed how important making is and how interesting it is when you look at how things are made. And we started that conversation yesterday at the Made in China exhibition in Rotterdam. But we heard it again in Sakshi's paper, in Steven's paper, in Gowun's paper. Paying attention to how things are made and those processes of making is really productive. So we get new tools, new approaches, new questions, new sources, and that leads us to new answers. Answers that may be debated, as we just heard in Guochen's paper and Carwen's questioning of those conclusions. But I think overall what we get is a really vibrant field, a really exciting new generation of scholars that bring new things, that show that we can keep doing this sort of thing for many years to come, and that we should keep investing in these relationships and in the new generation of scholars of Asian art. So all of that is really wonderful. What I'd like to do now is invite everyone who has been speaking today to come to the front, because we always have the traditional group photo. And while they all come and make their way to the front, I would like to invite everyone here to help thank the team in the back. Behind the camera there is a whole team of people, so thank you to all of them. So while they come to the front and we take a picture, well, we will find somebody to take the picture, but while they make their way here, let me just thank, and I think the speakers can give the audience a clap as well. Thank you for being here all day, and thank you for the questions, and thank you for participating in this symposium. Thank you very much. Zo, blijven we een beetje aan de zijkant. Gaat dat erop komen? Eentje met eentje zonder, denk ik. Oh, hey, let's have a photo. Well, let's have one photo with just the speakers.
Oh ja. Kijk naar het fotootje. Kaas. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, and let's have one with all of us here. Who's still here? Any other? Is Priya's not here anymore? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, they are. Thank you. And before we close this event this afternoon, I'd like to give you a small present.